My name is Clara Shaw. Before I became a Sterling, I was a girl who believed in the quiet permanence of things, the scent of old paper in the library where my mother worked, the steady rhythm of the tides against the sea wall in Port Blossom, the way the late afternoon sun would catch the dust motes dancing in our little clapboard house on Willow Street. I believed in stories, the ones bound in leather and the ones we tell ourselves to make sense of the world. For 10 years, the story I told myself was that I was happily married to Edward Sterling, son of the city's most venerable shipping dynasty, a man whose smile could charm the Spanish moss right off the ancient oaks that lined our avenues. Our life was a carefully curated collection of beautiful objects and prestigious events, all housed within the stately Georgian walls of the Sterling estate, a place that had stood overlooking the harbor for nearly 2 centuries. It was a life that felt both impossibly grand and suffocatingly small. I had my own wing of the house for my work, restoring antique books and documents, a passion I'd nurtured since childhood. It was my sanctuary, a place of ink and vellum and the patient work of bringing faded histories back to life. I thought Edward respected this part of me, this quiet corner of my soul that had nothing to do with the Sterling name. I was wrong. He saw it as he saw everything, a quaint accessory that added a certain intellectual charm to his portfolio of a wife. The slow erosion of our marriage wasn't a singular, cataclysmic event. It was a death by 1,000 paper cuts, a series of small, almost imperceptible betrayals that, over time, hollowed out the foundations of what I thought we had built. It was the way his eyes would glaze over when I spoke of a particularly challenging restoration project. It was the urgent late-night meetings that smelled faintly of a perfume I didn't own. It was the casual cruelty disguised as a joke, the way he'd belittle my opinions in front of his friends with a dismissive wave of his hand. I learned to live with the silences, to fill the empty spaces with my work, to tell myself that this was just the reality of a marriage to a man of his stature. I had become a master of self-deception, the most tragic kind of storyteller. But a restorer of old things knows that you cannot simply paper over a crack. The damage will always find its way to the surface. And so it did. He threw me a party for our 10th anniversary, not out of love, but out of a breathtaking, theatrical cruelty. It was a warm evening in early June, the air thick with the scent of night-blooming jasmine and salt from the harbor. 300 guests, the absolute pinnacle of Port Blossom society, drifted across the manicured lawns of the Sterling estate, their laughter mingling with the gentle strains of a string quartet. Edward had spared no expense. He'd told me with a proud smile, commissioned a small, elevated dais to be built at the edge of the rose garden so we could properly thank our guests. When the moment came, he led me up the 3 short steps, his hand a proprietary weight on the small of my back. He took the microphone, his voice smooth and practiced, the very sound of inherited confidence. He spoke of our decade together, weaving a beautiful tapestry of lies about love and partnership. The crowd listened, captivated. I listened, my heart a cold, still stone in my chest. I knew what was coming. Not the specifics, perhaps, but I knew this performance was the final act. He finished his speech, and the applause was warm and genuine. He turned to me, his smile not reaching the cold calculation in his eyes. And now, he whispered, his voice for my ears alone as he leaned in to kiss my cheek, a special gift for my darling wife. His fingers were cool as he slipped a thick, cream-colored envelope from his jacket pocket and pressed it into my hand. It wasn't sealed. The folded tops of legal documents were clearly visible. I wanted our friends to be here to support you through this, he murmured, his breath a puff of mint and malice against my ear. I thought it would be kinder than doing it alone. The spotlight seemed to narrow, pinning me in its glare. A collective gasp rippled through the nearest tables as people saw the envelope, understood its stark, legalistic implications. Divorce papers. At our 10th anniversary party. The sheer, premeditated audacity of it was a masterpiece of cruelty. He hadn't just ended our marriage, he had weaponized it, turning our shared history into a spectacle for public consumption. My hands did not shake as I held the papers. My breath did not catch. I had spent the last 6 months grieving the man I thought I had married. The man standing before me now was a stranger, and I felt nothing for him but a profound and weary pity. He thought this was his victory, his grand, final gesture of control. He had no idea that I had already written the story's true ending. "You look beautiful tonight, Clara," he said, his voice returning to its public, charming volume. "That dress, sea green. It always reminded me of the color of your eyes when you're about to cry." His words were meant to be the final, killing blow. He expected tears, a collapse, a scene that would cement his narrative of the wronged husband forced to leave his unstable, emotional wife. But I didn't cry. Instead, I gave him a small, sad smile. From the tiny, beaded clutch I carried, I retrieved a small, flat box wrapped in plain brown paper and tied with a simple linen string. It was unassuming, out of place amidst the glittering opulence of the evening. "Thank you, Edward," I said, my voice quiet but clear, carrying in the sudden, breathless silence. "I have a gift for you as well." Or rather, I corrected myself, turning my gaze toward the front table where his mother sat, her face a mask of frozen confusion. "A gift for your mother." I stepped down from the dais, the divorce papers still clutched in one hand. The crowd parted for me as if I were a ghost. I walked directly to Genevieve Sterling, her champagne flute suspended halfway to her lips, her eyes wide with a dawning apprehension. Edward never followed me. He remained on his stage, the author of the play, suddenly realizing his lead actress had gone off script. "Genevieve," I said softly, holding out the small, plain box. "I found something while I was organizing Frederick's old study. I believe it belongs to you." Her hands, adorned with the heavy, ancestral rings of the Sterling women, trembled as she reached for it. Her eyes darted from the box to my face, then to her son, who was now staring at us, a flicker of genuine alarm crossing his features. She knew. In that instant, she knew that whatever was inside that box was a secret she had buried half a lifetime ago, a truth I had patiently, carefully unearthed. The silence in the garden was absolute, broken only by the distant cry of a gull over the harbor. Genevieve fumbled with the simple knot of the linen string, her fingers suddenly clumsy. Edward started down from the stage, his voice sharp with impatience. "Mother? What is this?" "Clara, what game are you playing?" I didn't turn to look at him. My focus was entirely on the woman before me, a woman I had come to know better in the last 6 months than her own son had in his entire life. "It's no game, Edward," I said, my voice still gentle. "It's just a story that needs to be finished." The string came undone. Genevieve lifted the lid of the box. She didn't gasp or cry out. She simply went still, her breath catching in a faint, shuddering sigh. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded cotton wool, lay a single, tarnished silver locket shaped like a scallop shell. It was not a Sterling heirloom. It was cheap, sentimental, the kind of thing a young girl might buy at a seaside souvenir shop. "Where did you find this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "In the false bottom of your old hope chest," I answered quietly. "The one in the attic. It was tucked inside your father's copy of Leaves of Grass." Her gaze lifted to mine, and in her eyes I saw not anger, but a deep, desolate fear. It was the terror of an old ghost stepping out of the shadows and into the light. Edward was beside us now, his hand on his mother's shoulder. "A locket? What is all this melodrama about a piece of junk jewelry?" "Open it, Mother." With fingers that seemed to have aged 20 years in 20 seconds, Genevieve pressed the tiny clasp. The locket sprang open. On one side was a miniature, hand-tinted photograph of a young woman with Genevieve's features, but her hair was unbound and wild, her smile unburdened by the weight of a family name. On the other side was not a picture of the young, dashing Frederick Sterling, her husband. It was a lock of dark, curly hair, tied with a thread of gold. The crowd pressed closer, their curiosity a palpable force. They couldn't see the locket's contents, but they could see the effect it was having on the matriarch of Port Blossom's first family. It was the summer of 1983, Genevieve said, her voice a reedy whisper, her eyes fixed on the lock of hair as if it were a sacred relic. Frederick was in London for 3 months, finalizing the North Sea expansion. I was so lonely in this big house. Mother, stop, Edward commanded, his voice tight with panic. He was beginning to understand. Don't do this. But Genevieve seemed not to hear him. She was lost in a memory, 40 years in the past. He was a guest of the artist's colony down at the Cape, she murmured. Daniel. His name was Daniel Russo. He was a painter. He had the most beautiful, wild hair, and his eyes were the color of the sea after a storm. She looked up, not at Edward, but at me. He was the only person who ever saw me. Just me. Not the sterling name, not the sterling fortune. Just Genevieve. A wave of murmurs swept through the guests. Daniel Russo. The name was unfamiliar, a ghost from a past no one had known existed. You had an affair, Edward stated, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. It was the voice of a lawyer summarizing a case, stripping the facts of all their painful, human detail. Genevieve nodded, a single tear tracing a path through the carefully applied powder on her cheek. It was a lifetime ago. A different world. When Frederick came home, it was over. I put the locket away and I never looked at it again. I tried to forget he ever existed. But you didn't, did you? I said, my voice full of a sorrow that was not just for me, but for her, for the life she might have had. Because 9 months later, Edward was born. The silence that followed was heavier, more profound, than any I had ever experienced. It was the silence of a dynasty cracking at its very foundation. Edward stared at his mother, his face ashen, his mouth slightly agape. He looked from her to me, the pieces of a puzzle he never knew existed clicking into place in his mind. His height, his build, his ambition, that was all Frederick Sterling. But his eyes, the exact shade of the sea after a storm, and the dark, unruly hair he spent a fortune trying to tame, that was Daniel Russo. No, Edward breathed, shaking his head slowly. No. You're lying. Both of you. This is some sick, twisted revenge plot you cooked up together. But he knew. And everyone watching knew. They knew because they were looking at Genevieve, whose face was a portrait of heartbreaking confession. And they were looking at Edward, truly looking at him for the first time and seeing the ghost of a penniless artist in the face of the man they had always known as Frederick Sterling's son and heir. It was my love for history, for the truth hidden in faded ink and brittle paper, that had led me here. It began not with a dramatic revelation, but with a quiet afternoon in the Sterling Library, a room as large as my childhood home, paneled in dark mahogany and smelling of leather and lemon oil. Genevieve had asked me to help her sort through her late husband's personal papers, a task she'd been avoiding for the 5 years since his death. Frederick Sterling had been a man of meticulous records, and his study was a monument to a life lived in ledgers and legal documents. I was 3 days into the project, cataloging correspondence, when I found the journal. It wasn't Frederick's. It was a small, leather-bound book, tucked inside a larger volume on maritime law. The handwriting was feminine, elegant, and familiar. It was Genevieve's. It seemed to be a diary from her early years of marriage, filled mostly with notes about household accounts, dinner party menus, and social obligations. It was mundane, almost painfully so, until I reached the entries for the summer of 1983. The tone shifted. The neat, constrained script became a passionate, looping scrawl. She wrote of loneliness, of feeling like a ghost in her own home. And then, she wrote of Daniel. D. came to the house today to sketch the gardens. He has no idea who I am, and it is the most liberating feeling I have ever known. He thinks I am simply the caretaker's wife. For weeks, she chronicled their secret meetings, their conversations about art and poetry, the slow, inevitable slide into an affair. It was a portrait of a woman starved for connection, finding it not in the hallowed halls of her life, but in the arms of a transient painter who saw the woman behind the name. The entries were filled with a desperate, breathless joy. And then, a different kind of desperation. Frederick comes home in 2 weeks. D wants me to leave with him. He says we can go to New Mexico, live in a small adobe house, and he will paint the sky, and I will finally learn to breathe. But how can I leave this? Not the money, not the house. The history, the weight of it. I am a Sterling. It is all I know how to be. The last entry about Daniel was heartbreaking. He left this morning. He gave me a small locket with the lock of his hair. He said it was so I would not forget what it felt like to be real. I will forget. I must. The diary ended there. But my discovery did not. A few weeks later, while helping Genevieve clear out some old furniture from the attic, I came across her cedar hope chest. It was locked, and Genevieve claimed to have lost the key decades ago. That night, I returned to the attic with a set of tools from my restoration workshop. The lock was old and simple. It opened with a soft click. Inside, beneath a layer of yellowed linens and her wedding veil, was a box of old medical documents. I found what I was looking for in a file from Frederick's physician, dated 1975, 8 years before Edward was born. It was a confidential letter to Frederick, confirming the results of a series of tests. As we discussed, Frederick, the damage from the mumps you suffered as a teenager was, I'm afraid, irreversible. The tests confirm you are sterile. I know this is difficult news, but Genevieve is a strong woman. You will find a way to build a family together, perhaps through adoption. Frederick Sterling could not have children. The two secrets, locked away in different parts of the house, decades apart, came together in my hands to tell a single, devastating truth. Edward was not a Sterling by blood. His entire identity, the legacy he wore with such arrogance, was a lie. A lie Frederick had either chosen to live with or one he had never known. For weeks, I did nothing. The knowledge sat inside me, a heavy, indigestible stone. I watched Edward at dinner parties, listened to him pontificate about the Sterling legacy and the purity of the bloodline, and I felt a grief so profound it almost choked me. He was a fraud, and he didn't even know it. My first instinct was to tell him, to share the burden of this truth. But his cruelty had been escalating. The small slights had become open contempt. I discovered his affair with Isabel, a junior associate at his firm, not through any clever snooping, but because he had grown careless, arrogant in his belief that I was too passive, too invested in the comfort of our life, to ever challenge him. I realized then that telling him the truth would not be an act of intimacy, it would be giving him another weapon to use against me. He would twist it, deny it, accuse me of forging the documents to hurt him. The truth needed more than my word to support it. It needed a witness. I hired a man named Mr. Finch. He wasn't a private investigator in the traditional sense. He was a genealogical researcher and historian, a man whose discretion was as legendary as his skill. I told him I was working on a private history of the Sterling family. I asked him to find any living relatives of an artist named Daniel Russo, who had spent the summer of 1983 at the Port Blossom Artists Colony. It took Mr. Finch 2 months. Daniel Russo had indeed gone to New Mexico. He had married, had a daughter, and had died of a heart attack 10 years ago. He had become a moderately successful landscape painter, his work known for its soulful, melancholic depictions of the desert sky. His widow and daughter still lived in Santa Fe. Mr. Finch, with infinite tact, made contact. He explained he was researching the colony and had come across Daniel's name. He procured photographs. And, most importantly, he managed to obtain a DNA sample from Daniel's daughter under the pretext of a genealogical study of the colony's artists and their descendants. The cost was considerable, But Edward's private bank account, the one he thought I knew nothing about, covered it easily. The lab results came back on a Tuesday. The probability that Edward and Daniel Russo's daughter were half-siblings was 99.9%. I held the proof in my hands, and I felt no triumph, only a deep, aching sadness. This was the end of my marriage, the end of the story I had told myself for a decade. But it was also the beginning of the truth. When Edward told me about the grand anniversary party he was planning, when I saw the cruel glint in his eye as he described the stage he was having built, I knew how the story had to be told. Not for revenge, but for the quiet, unassailable power of a truth that had been buried for far too long. The aftermath was not a storm, but a quiet, chilling fog that settled over the garden. Edward stood, poleaxed, between his mother's quiet confession and my silent affirmation. He looked around at the faces of his friends, his colleagues, the pillars of Port Blossom society, and for the first time in his life, he saw not admiration, but a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. He had been rendered an outsider in his own home. Isabel, the young associate with whom he'd been having the affair, was one of the first to leave. I saw her from the corner of my eye. She didn't run. She simply placed her napkin on the table, smoothed her dress, and walked away with the measured, deliberate pace of someone escaping a burning building. She never looked back. Her dreams of becoming the next Mrs. Sterling had just turned to ash. The other guests followed, not in a rush, but in a slow, funereal procession. They offered hushed, awkward condolences to Genevieve, who sat staring into the middle distance, clutching the locket in her hand. They avoided my eyes completely, as if I were the bearer of a contagion. And they walked past Edward as if he were invisible. For a man whose entire existence was predicated on being seen, it was a fate worse than scorn. I didn't stay to watch the final dissolution. My part in the story was over. I placed the divorce papers Edward had given me on the table next to Genevieve's untouched champagne glass. Then I turned to her. Frederick knew, I said, my voice so low only she could hear. In his private papers, there was a letter from his doctor. He knew he couldn't have children. He knew Edward wasn't his. And he loved you both anyway. He chose to. A single, silent tear fell from her eye and splashed onto the back of her hand. It was the only answer I needed. Frederick Sterling, the man Edward had spent his life trying to emulate while simultaneously holding in contempt for his softness, had been the true heart of the family. His legacy wasn't in shipping contracts or stock portfolios. It was in an act of quiet, profound grace. A grace his son had never learned. I walked away then, through the scattering of guests, across the lawn that was still aglow with fairy lights, and into the grand house that had never truly felt like my home. I packed a single bag in silence, the one I had prepared weeks ago. It contained my mother's books, a few changes of clothes, and my restoration tools. Nothing else in that house belonged to me. As I was leaving, Edward's voice called my name from the top of the grand staircase. Clara. His voice was hollow, stripped of its usual authority. I paused at the front door but did not turn. Where will you go? He asked. Home, I said, and for the first time, I wasn't sure what that word meant. But I knew it was not here. I walked out into the cool night air, leaving the door open behind me, and never looked back. The first few weeks were a blur of legal meetings and empty rooms. I rented a small, second-floor apartment above a quiet bookshop in the city's historic district, a neighborhood of cobblestone streets and hidden courtyards that Edward had always dismissed as unfashionably quaint. The apartment was small, with slanted floors and windows that overlooked a tangled garden. It was filled with light. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. The divorce was surprisingly swift. Edward did not contest it. His lawyers, and my own, handled the division of assets with a cold efficiency. The Sterling estate and the majority of the liquid assets were tied up in family trusts to which Edward, it was now legally established, had no claim. I asked for nothing beyond what I had brought into the marriage, a small inheritance from my parents, and enough to cover my legal fees. I wanted a clean break, a life unburdened by the weight of sterling money. Maria, my lawyer and my oldest friend, told me Edward had moved out of the estate and into a featureless condominium downtown. He had taken a leave of absence from the firm. "He's a ghost," she said over coffee one afternoon. "People see him, but no one talks to him. It's like he's been erased from the social register." I felt a pang of something, not pity, exactly, but a deep, impersonal sorrow for the boy who had grown up believing a lie and the man who had then built his own life on a foundation of new ones. Genevieve and I spoke once. She called me a month after the party. Her voice was frail. "He's gone, Clara," she said. "Edward. He left a note. He said he was going to find himself. Or find his father. I don't know which." "How are you, Genevieve?" I asked. There was a long pause. "I am unburdened," she said, and the word was filled with a century of sadness and relief. The Historical Society called. "They're interested in Frederick's papers. In his real story." "That's good," I said. "His is a story worth telling." We said our goodbyes, and I knew we would likely never speak again. Our connection had been forged in the crucible of her family's secrets, and with those secrets now in the open, the bond had dissolved. I began to rebuild my life, not with grand gestures, but with small, quiet acts of reclamation. I started taking on restoration projects again, working from a small studio I set up in my spare bedroom. The meticulous work of mending torn pages and strengthening crumbling bindings felt like a metaphor for what I was doing for my own soul. I spent my evenings reading in the window seat, walking the cobblestone streets at dusk, rediscovering the city that had been my home long before I became a sterling. One Saturday, driven by a whim, I visited the bookshop downstairs. It was run by a kind, elderly man named Mr. Hemlock, who was looking to retire. We started talking, first about books, then about life. By the end of the month, I had used the last of my inheritance to buy the shop from him. I renamed it Shaw and Company. Booksellers, my name, my own 2 feet. The work was hard, the hours long, but it was mine. The shop became a sanctuary, a place of quiet conversations and shared stories. It was the opposite of the Sterling estate. It was open, welcoming, and unassuming. It was real. 6 months after I left my old life, a package arrived at the shop. It was postmarked from Santa Fe, New Mexico. There was no return address. Inside was a small, beautifully rendered watercolor painting of a desert sky at sunset, all fiery oranges and deep, soulful purples. Tucked into the wrapping was a simple and signed note, written in a bold, artistic hand. It said only, "Thank you for the truth. It sets everyone free." I didn't know if it was from Edward, or from Daniel Rousseau's daughter, or from some other soul touched by the ripples of that long-ago summer. It didn't matter. I hung the painting in the window of my bookshop, where the afternoon light would catch it. Sometimes, when the shop is quiet and the dust motes are dancing in the sunbeams, I think about the story of Edward and Genevieve and Frederick. It is a tragedy, in its way, a story of love and lies and the crushing weight of legacy. But my own story, I have come to realize, is not a tragedy. It is a story of restoration. It is the story of a woman who learned to read the faded ink of her own life, to find the truth hidden in the margins, and to carefully, patiently, bind the pages back together, stronger and more beautiful than they were before. And it is a story that is, finally and completely, my own.